White cop lies about black woman in court, not knowing who she really is. You underestimated me, Officer Patterson, but the truth always finds a way. What could make a seasoned police officer break down completely in front of a packed courtroom? A confident cop accuses a black woman of resisting arrest and assault. His story seems bulletproof until she takes the stand and systematically destroys every single lie he told. Who is she, and why does her calm testimony make the officer visibly panic while the jury watches in stunned silence? Because Officer Patterson thought he was facing an ordinary citizen who would be intimidated into silence. He was dead wrong. This is the story of how one arrogant lie collided with someone carrying very dangerous knowledge, and how a fight for justice became a psychological war where only truth could survive. Let's dive into it. The early morning sun peeked through the heavy drapes of the downtown courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. The building, with its imposing columns and soaring ceilings, had witnessed decades of justice and injustice. Today, it would host a case that would be remembered long after the gavel fell for the final time. The courtroom hummed with nervous energy. Rows of wooden benches, filled with a mixture of spectators, curious townspeople, journalists with notepads at the ready, and a cluster of police officers in crisp uniforms occupying the back rows like a silent wall of blue solidarity. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that precedes moments when truth and lies collide in spectacular fashion. At the defense table sat Jasmine Mitchell, her presence both commanding and serene. At 36, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that made people take notice without understanding why. Her dark brown skin seemed to glow under the courtroom's fluorescent lights, and her hair was pulled back in a neat, professional style that framed her angular face. She wore a navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse, colors chosen deliberately to project both authority and humility. But it was her eyes that truly set her apart. Dark, intelligent, and impossibly calm, they moved across the room with a precision that suggested she was cataloging every detail, every face, every micro-expression. To the casual observer, she appeared to be just another defendant, perhaps nervous about her fate. But those paying closer attention might have noticed something unusual. The way she sat with perfect posture, the controlled breathing, the hands that remained steady despite the gravity of her situation. Beside her, Benjamin Carter shuffled through his legal documents with barely concealed anxiety. The young black attorney, fresh from law school with student loans still haunting his bank account, had taken this case not because he was confident of victory, but because something about Jasmine Mitchell had convinced him that she was telling the truth. Now surrounded by the weight of the legal system and facing an uphill battle against a decorated police officer, he was beginning to question his judgment. "State versus Jasmine Mitchell," announced the bailiff, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The Honorable Judge Patricia Hendricks presiding." Judge Hendricks entered the courtroom with measured steps, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense expression. At 58, she had presided over thousands of cases, and her weathered face told the story of someone who had seen every variation of human nature. She settled into her chair behind the imposing wooden bench, her sharp eyes surveying the packed courtroom. "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the bench. "We are here to hear the case of the state of Illinois versus Jasmine Mitchell. The defendant is charged with resisting arrest, assault on a police officer, and disorderly conduct." At the plaintiff's table, Officer Michael Patterson adjusted his tie with the confidence of a man who had never lost a court case involving his testimony. At 34, he was considered a model police officer by his superiors, 12 years on the force, numerous commendations, and a conviction rate that made prosecutors happy. His sandy brown hair was perfectly combed, his uniform pressed to military standards, and his pale blue eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to being believed without question. Patterson's presence dominated his side of the courtroom. At 6 feet 2 inches with broad shoulders, and the kind of authoritative bearing that came from years of unquestioned power, he embodied everything the public expected from law enforcement. When he spoke, people listened. When he testified, juries believed him. Today he expected nothing different. "Your Honor," began District Attorney Robert Sullivan, a silver-haired man whose expensive suit and practiced manner spoke to decades of successful prosecutions. "The state will prove that on the evening of March 15th, The defendant violently resisted lawful arrest and assaulted Officer Patterson in the performance of his duties. Jasmine watched Sullivan speak, her expression revealing nothing. But behind those calm eyes, a mind trained in psychological operations and tactical assessment was analyzing every word, every gesture, every tell that revealed the prosecution's strategy. She had faced more dangerous opponents in more hostile environments, but she had never fought a battle where the weapons were words and the battlefield was public opinion. What the courtroom didn't know, what no one except Benjamin Carter suspected, was that Jasmine Mitchell possessed skills that would make this confrontation unlike anything Officer Patterson had ever experienced. But those skills would remain hidden for now, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "Mr. Carter," Judge Hendricks said, turning to the defense table, "are you prepared to proceed?" Benjamin Carter stood slowly, his voice steady despite the nerves that threatened to overwhelm him. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense is ready." What happened next would change everything Patterson thought he knew about the woman sitting across from him. Officer Michael Patterson rose from his seat with theatrical precision, every movement calculated to project authority and credibility. His polished black shoes clicked against the courtroom floor as he made his way to the witness stand, pausing briefly to straighten his already perfect tie. The gesture was unnecessary, but Patterson had learned over his 12-year career that juries responded to symbols of order and professionalism. As he settled into the witness chair, Patterson's eyes swept across the packed courtroom. He nodded slightly toward his fellow officers in the back rows, receiving subtle nods of support in return. This was his domain, his moment to shape the narrative that would determine Jasmine Mitchell's fate. "Officer Patterson," began D.A. Sullivan, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man who had conducted this dance countless times before. "Please state your name and position for the record." "Michael Anthony Patterson, badge number 2847. I've been a patrol officer with the Chicago Police Department for 12 years, currently assigned to the South District." "And on the evening of March 15th, were you on duty?" Patterson leaned slightly toward the microphone, his voice clear and authoritative. "Yes, sir. I was working the evening shift, approximately 8:30 p.m., when I received a call about suspicious activity near the corner of Magnolia and 5th Street. In the gallery, a few spectators leaned forward. This was the moment they had come to hear, the official version of events that would either condemn or vindicate the woman sitting quietly at the defense table. "What did you observe when you arrived at the scene?" Sullivan continued. Patterson's expression grew serious, the look of a professional recounting unpleasant but necessary facts. "I observed the defendant loitering outside Morrison's Electronics, which had been closed for over an hour. She appeared to be looking into the storefront windows, and when I approached, her behavior immediately became suspicious." From her seat, Jasmine watched Patterson with the kind of focused attention that would have made him uncomfortable if he had understood its true nature. She was reading him, not just his words, but the micro-expressions that flickered across his face, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the witness stand just a fraction too tightly. Everything about his testimony was being processed through filters that Patterson couldn't even imagine. "Can you describe this suspicious behavior?" Sullivan asked. "When I identified myself and asked what she was doing there, she became immediately defensive," Patterson replied, his voice taking on the tone of someone describing a dangerous encounter. "She refused to provide identification when requested and began questioning my authority to ask for it." Several jurors exchanged glances. The refusal to provide ID was often seen as a red flag, and Patterson knew it. "And how did you respond to her refusal to cooperate?" Patterson straightened in his chair, projecting the image of a patient professional pushed beyond reasonable limits. "I explained that I was investigating a report of suspicious activity and that her cooperation would help clear up the matter quickly. But instead of complying, she became increasingly agitated." The word agitated hung in the air, loaded with implications that every person in the courtroom understood. It was police code for a situation escalating beyond control. "At what point did the situation become physical?" Sullivan inquired. Patterson paused as if the memory was particularly difficult to recount. "I attempted to de-escalate by placing my hand on her arm, a standard calming technique we're trained to use. That's when she became violent." The courtroom was completely silent now, the weight of his testimony settling over the proceedings like a heavy blanket. "She struck me in the chest with her fist," Patterson continued, his voice growing more strained. "Then she attempted to reach for my service weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her for both our safety." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reaching for an officer's weapon was serious, potentially deadly serious. "And did you fear for your safety, Officer Patterson?" "Absolutely," Patterson replied without hesitation. "A suspect reaching for your weapon is every officer's worst nightmare. I responded with the minimum force necessary to subdue her and effect the arrest." Sullivan nodded gravely. "Thank you, Officer Patterson. Your witness, Mr. Carter?" Benjamin Carter stood slowly, his heart pounding as he approached the witness stand. This was the moment that would define not just the case, but potentially his entire legal career. But the truth was even more shocking than anyone in that courtroom could imagine. Benjamin Carter approached the witness stand with deliberate steps, his briefcase containing more than Officer Patterson could possibly know. The young attorney's nervous energy from earlier had transformed into something sharper, more focused. He had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, and while he couldn't reveal his full strategy yet, he was about to plant the first seeds of doubt. "Good morning, Officer Patterson," Carter began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Good morning," Patterson replied, his tone cordial but guarded. He had faced cross-examination before, and his experience told him to remain calm and stick to his story. "You testified that you've been with the Chicago Police Department for 12 years. In that time, how many arrests have you made that resulted in charges of resisting arrest and assault on an officer?" Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't keep an exact count, but it's part of the job. Sometimes people don't want to cooperate." "Would you say more than 50 such arrests, more than 100? "Objection," Sullivan called out. "Relevance?" "I'll allow it," Judge Hendricks ruled. "Answer the question, Officer Patterson." "Probably somewhere in between," Patterson replied, his voice taking on a slight edge. Carter nodded, making a note on his legal pad. "And in all these arrests, how often has your body camera malfunctioned?" The question hit like a physical blow. Patterson's jaw tightened imperceptibly, a micro-expression that didn't escape Jasmine's trained observation. "Equipment malfunctions happen," Patterson said carefully. "It's technology. But specifically on the night of March 15th, your body camera failed to record the encounter with my client. Is that correct?" "That's correct." Carter paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Patterson uncomfortable. "Convenient timing, wouldn't you agree?" "Objection," Sullivan barked. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Hendricks ruled. "Rephrase, Mr. Carter. Officer Patterson, in your 12 years of service, approximately how many times has your body camera malfunctioned during an arrest where force was used?" Patterson shifted in his chair, his composure beginning to show hairline fractures. "I don't keep statistics on equipment failures. But you would remember if it happened frequently, wouldn't you?" "It doesn't happen frequently." "So this was unusual?" "Yes, it was unusual," Patterson admitted, his voice tight. From her seat at the defense table, Jasmine observed the exchange with the analytical precision of someone trained to read human behavior under stress. Patterson's tells were becoming more apparent, the slight clenching of his jaw, the way his fingers drummed almost imperceptibly against the witness stand, the forced steadiness of his voice that betrayed underlying tension. Carter continued his methodical dismantling. "Officer Patterson, you testified that my client struck you in the chest. Did this blow cause you to seek medical attention?" "No, it wasn't necessary." "Did you photograph the injury?" "There wasn't visible bruising." "Did you report the injury to a superior officer?" Patterson hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for several jurors to notice. "It was documented in my arrest report." "But no separate injury report was filed. The arrest report was sufficient." Carter nodded, making another note. "Now, about my client allegedly reaching for your weapon. You're wearing your service weapon on your right side, is that correct?" "Yes." "And you testified that you grabbed my client's arm. Which arm?" Patterson's eyes darted momentarily toward the prosecution table. "Her right arm." "So if you were restraining her right arm, how exactly was she able to reach across her body toward your weapon with her left hand?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Patterson's face flushed slightly as he processed the implications. She attempted to reach with her left hand while struggling with her right." While you were restraining her right arm? Yes. And you, a trained officer with 12 years of experience and approximately 60 pounds on my client, were unable to prevent a woman with one free arm from nearly accessing your weapon. She was stronger than she appeared, Patterson said, his voice losing some of its earlier authority. Several jurors exchanged glances. The story was beginning to sound less convincing. Officer Patterson, have you ever been the subject of any complaints regarding excessive use of force? Objection! Sullivan shot to his feet. The officer's personnel record is not relevant to this case. Judge Hendricks considered for a moment. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Officer Patterson. Patterson's face had gone pale. There have been a few complaints over the years. They're part of the job. People don't like being arrested. A few? Carter pressed. Would you say 3 complaints, 5, 10? I don't recall the exact number. More than 10? Patterson's silence spoke volumes. Little did Patterson know that every lie he told was being catalogued by someone with very special training. The tension in the courtroom had reached a palpable level as Benjamin Carter returned to his seat, leaving Officer Patterson visibly shaken on the witness stand. The confident demeanor Patterson had displayed at the beginning of his testimony had cracked, revealing glimpses of something darker underneath. Your Honor, Judge Hendricks announced, we'll take a 15-minute recess before continuing. During the break, whispered conversations filled the hallway outside the courtroom. Spectators debated what they had witnessed, while journalists scribbled notes and made phone calls. The police officers who had come to support Patterson huddled together, their earlier confidence replaced by concerned murmurs. Jasmine Mitchell sat quietly on a bench in the hallway, her composure unchanged despite the intensity of the proceedings. Benjamin Carter paced nearby, occasionally glancing at his client with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. You ready for this? He asked quietly, sitting down beside her. Jasmine turned to look at him, and for a moment Carter saw something in her eyes that made him understand why she had been so calm throughout the entire ordeal. There was a depth there, a well of experience and strength that suggested she had faced far worse than a hostile courtroom. I've been ready since the night this happened, she replied simply. When court reconvened, Judge Hendricks called the courtroom to order. Mr. Carter, are you prepared to call your first witness? Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Jasmine Mitchell. The silence that fell over the courtroom was different now, heavier, more expectant. Everyone sensed that they were about to hear something significant, though none could have imagined just how significant it would prove to be. Jasmine rose from the defense table with fluid grace, her movements controlled and purposeful. She walked to the witness stand without hurry, her dark eyes scanning the room with the same analytical precision she had displayed throughout the trial. When she placed her hand on the Bible and took the oath, her voice was clear and steady. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. As she settled into the witness chair, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease, several jurors leaned forward involuntarily. There was something about her presence that commanded attention, not through force or drama, but through an unshakable sense of authority. Good morning, Ms. Mitchell, Carter began. Please state your full name for the record. Jasmine Elizabeth Mitchell. And where do you currently reside? Chicago, Illinois. I've lived there for the past 8 months. Carter nodded, his questions designed to establish the basics before moving to more explosive territory. What is your occupation? I'm currently between positions, Jasmine replied, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I recently completed a long-term assignment and am considering my next steps. From the prosecution table, D.A. Sullivan frowned. The vague answer suggested there was more to the story, but he couldn't quite place what it might be. Now, Ms. Mitchell, I want to ask you about the events of March 15th. In your own words, please tell the court what happened that evening. Jasmine took a slow breath, her gaze moving across the courtroom before settling on the jury. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet strength that made every word feel weighted with truth. I had dinner with a friend in the neighborhood and was walking back to where I had parked my car. I stopped to check my phone for directions. I was still getting familiar with that area of the city. That's when Officer Patterson approached me. How did he approach you? He pulled up in his patrol car, got out, and immediately shined his flashlight directly into my face. His first words to me were, "What are you doing here?" And how did you respond? I told him I was just checking directions on my phone. I asked if there was a problem. Patterson shifted uncomfortably at the plaintiff's table. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. What happened next? Jasmine's expression remained calm, but there was steel in her voice. He demanded to see my ID. When I asked what I had done wrong, he said I was being uncooperative and told me that people like me needed to learn when to keep quiet. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The phrase "people like me" carried obvious racial implications that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. Did you comply with his request for identification? I told him I would be happy to show my ID once he explained why he needed it. I hadn't broken any laws, and I wanted to understand the legal basis for his request. How did Officer Patterson react to that? Jasmine's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. He grabbed my arm and told me I was under arrest for resisting. Had you resisted in any way up to that point? No. I had remained calm and asked reasonable questions. Carter paused, allowing the weight of her testimony to settle over the courtroom. Ms. Mitchell, Officer Patterson testified that you struck him and attempted to reach for his weapon. Is that true? Jasmine looked directly at Patterson, her gaze unwavering. That is completely false. I never struck Officer Patterson, and I never attempted to reach for his weapon. The certainty in her voice was absolute, leaving no room for doubt or interpretation. Then how do you explain the charges against you? For the first time since taking the stand, Jasmine's expression showed a hint of something deeper, not anger, but a kind of righteous determination that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. Officer Patterson lied, she said simply. He lied about what happened, he lied about my behavior, and he lied about the threat I posed. The question is why. What they discovered next would destroy everything Patterson believed he could get away with. The courtroom held its collective breath as Jasmine's words hung in the air. Her calm accusation of perjury against a decorated police officer should have seemed outrageous, but something about her steady demeanor made it impossible to dismiss. District Attorney Sullivan rose quickly from his chair, sensing the need to regain control of the narrative. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is offering conclusions rather than testimony about facts. Sustained, Judge Hendricks ruled, though her sharp eyes remained fixed on Jasmine with obvious interest. The witness will confine her answers to what she observed and experienced. Carter nodded, understanding that they needed to build their case methodically. Ms. Mitchell, you've testified that Officer Patterson's account of events is inaccurate. Do you have any evidence to support your version of what happened? Jasmine's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not smug but knowing. Actually, yes, I do. Carter walked to the defense table and retrieved a manila envelope, its contents carefully prepared for this moment. Your Honor, the defense would like to present Exhibit A. As Carter opened the envelope, Patterson's face went ashen. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering urgently, but D.A. Sullivan was focused entirely on whatever was about to be revealed. Miss Mitchell, can you identify what Mr. D. Carter is holding? That appears to be a USB drive containing security camera footage from Morrison's Electronics. The courtroom erupted into whispers and gasps. Judge Hendricks struck her gavel sharply. Order! I will have order in this courtroom. Patterson's hands gripped the edge of his table so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The confident officer who had taken the stand earlier was gone, replaced by a man whose carefully constructed lies were beginning to unravel in real time. Miss Mitchell, how did you obtain this footage? The morning after my arrest, I returned to the area and spoke with Mr. David Kim, the owner of Morrison's Electronics. I explained what had happened and asked if his security system might have captured the interaction. D.A. Sullivan shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense should have disclosed this evidence during discovery. Benjamin Carter remained calm. Your Honor, this evidence was obtained legally, and we are presenting it now in good faith. The defense attempted to contact the prosecution regarding additional evidence, but our calls were not returned. Judge Hendricks considered for a moment, her weathered face betraying nothing. I'll allow it, but I want to review this footage before it's shown to the jury. Bailiff, please set up the viewing equipment. As the courtroom's audiovisual system was prepared, tension filled the air like electricity before a storm. Patterson wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief, his earlier composure completely shattered. While we're setting up the equipment, Carter continued, Ms. Mitchell, can you tell the court what this footage shows? The security camera is positioned above the store's entrance and has a clear view of the sidewalk where Officer Patterson approached me. The footage shows the entire interaction from beginning to end. And does this footage support your testimony about what occurred? Completely. Patterson leaned over to whisper frantically to D.A. Sullivan, but the prosecutor waved him off, his attention focused on the unfolding disaster. The bailiff nodded to Judge Hendricks, indicating that the equipment was ready. Very well, the judge announced. We'll view this footage in chambers first. The jury will remain seated while counsel and I review the evidence. The next 20 minutes felt like hours to everyone in the courtroom. Spectators whispered among themselves, trying to guess what the footage might reveal. The police officers in the back row exchanged increasingly worried glances, while Patterson sat motionless, staring at his hands. When Judge Hendricks returned to the bench, her expression was grim. D.A. Sullivan followed, his face pale and drawn. Carter walked with renewed confidence, while Patterson's attorney looked like a man whose entire case had just collapsed. After reviewing the footage, Judge Hendricks announced, the court finds it to be relevant and admissible. Bailiff, please dim the light so the jury can view Exhibit A. The large screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life, showing a black and white security feed timestamp from March 15th at 8:47 p.m. The image was surprisingly clear, showing the sidewalk in front of Morrison's Electronics. The footage began with Jasmine walking into the frame, stopping near the storefront to look at her phone. She appeared relaxed, simply a woman checking directions on a quiet evening. Then Patterson's patrol car entered the frame. What the video showed next would shock everyone in that courtroom, because the footage captured not just what happened, but what came next that shocked everyone in the room. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the security footage played on the large screen. The timestamp showed 8:47 p.m. on March 15th, and the image quality was remarkably clear for a store security system. On screen, Jasmine Mitchell appeared exactly as she had described, a woman simply checking her phone for directions. She stood calmly on the sidewalk, occasionally glancing at the storefront, but showing no signs of suspicious behavior. Her posture was relaxed, her movements natural. Then Officer Patterson's patrol car pulled into frame, its headlights cutting through the evening shadows. Even in the black and white footage, Patterson's aggressive demeanor was unmistakable from the moment he stepped out of his vehicle. The courtroom could see Patterson approaching Jasmine with his flashlight already drawn and pointed directly at her face, exactly as she had testified. His body language was confrontational from the first moment of contact, contradicting his earlier claim of a professional, de-escalating approach. But it was the audio that proved most damaging. The store's security system includes audio recording, Benjamin Carter explained as the footage continued. The sound quality is clear enough to capture the entire conversation. Patterson's voice came through the courtroom speakers with startling clarity. "What are you doing here?" Jasmine's response was calm and respectful. "I'm just checking directions on my phone. Is there a problem, officer? I need to see some ID. May I ask why? I haven't done anything wrong." The footage showed Patterson's immediate physical escalation, his hand going to his belt, his posture becoming more aggressive, his flashlight remaining pointed directly at Jasmine's eyes. "Because I said so. People like you don't get to question my authority." Gasps filled the courtroom. The racial undertones that Jasmine had described were now undeniably documented. On screen, Jasmine maintained her calm demeanor even as Patterson's behavior became increasingly hostile. "I'm happy to show you my ID once you explain the legal basis for requiring it." That's when Patterson grabbed her arm. The footage showed Patterson's sudden physical contact, his grip on Jasmine's right arm, and her natural reaction of trying to step back. But what it didn't show was any attempt by Jasmine to strike Patterson or reach for his weapon. "Let go of my arm," Jasmine's voice came through the speakers, still controlled despite the escalating situation. "You're under arrest for resisting." "I'm not resisting. You grabbed me first." The video continued to roll, showing Patterson handcuffing Jasmine, while she remained largely passive, occasionally asking him to explain what she was being arrested for. At no point did the footage show her striking Patterson or reaching for his weapon. As the video ended, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The evidence was devastating to Patterson's credibility, but more than that, it revealed a pattern of behavior that suggested this wasn't an isolated incident. Judge Hendricks was the first to speak. Officer Patterson, having viewed this footage, do you wish to modify any part of your earlier testimony? Patterson's face had gone completely white. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he struggled to formulate a response. Your Honor, the video, it doesn't show everything. There might have been moments when— Officer Patterson, the judge interrupted sharply, I'm asking you a direct question. Does this video accurately depict your interaction with Ms. Mitchell? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Patterson finally answered. The video appears to be accurate, but it doesn't capture the full context. D. Sullivan buried his head in his hands, knowing that his case had just disintegrated before his eyes. Carter seized the moment. Ms. Mitchell, does this footage accurately represent what occurred on the evening of March 15th? Yes, it does. And Officer Patterson's testimony about you striking him and reaching for his weapon? As the footage clearly shows, that never happened. But as devastating as the video evidence was, no one in that courtroom suspected that there was still more to come. Because what they were about to discover about Jasmine Mitchell would not only explain her unusual calm throughout this ordeal, it would reveal why Officer Patterson had made the worst mistake of his career. Carter returned to his notes, his confidence now complete. Ms. Mitchell, I want to ask you about something else. You mentioned earlier that you recently completed a long-term assignment. Can you be more specific about your professional background? For the first time since taking the stand, Jasmine hesitated, not from uncertainty, but because she was choosing her words carefully. I spent the last 25 years in service to my country, she said slowly. I recently retired from a position that required extensive training in observation, analysis, and other specialized skills. The vagueness of her answer sent a ripple of curiosity through the courtroom, but Patterson was beyond caring about mysteries. He was staring at the defense table with the look of a man watching his entire career collapse in real time. But the truth was even more incredible than anyone imagined. Benjamin Carter sensed the shift in the courtroom's energy. The video evidence had already destroyed Officer Patterson's credibility, but he could feel that the jury, the gallery, and even Judge Hendricks were hungry for more. Jasmine's cryptic reference to her professional background had opened a door that Carter was prepared to walk through. Ms. Mitchell, when you say you spent 25 years in service to your country, are you referring to military service? Yes. Carter paused, letting the simple answer resonate. Several jurors sat up straighter, their perception of the defendant shifting in real time. Can you tell the court which branch of the military? United States Navy. The respect that automatically accompanied military service was palpable in the room, but Patterson's face had gone beyond pale to a sickly gray color. Something about the direction of the questioning was triggering an instinct that told him things were about to get much worse. And what was your rank upon retirement? Jasmine straightened slightly in her chair, her posture taking on an almost imperceptible military bearing. Lieutenant Commander. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Lieutenant Commander was not a low-level enlisted position. It represented significant responsibility and extensive training. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, what was your specialty in the Navy? For the first time since the trial began, Jasmine's calm facade showed a hint of something deeper. Not pride exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement of capabilities that most people couldn't imagine. I was a Navy SEAL. The courtroom erupted. Judge Hendricks struck her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the revelation had sent shockwaves through every person present. Journalists furiously scribbled notes, spectators turned to each other in amazement, and the police officers in the back row looked as though they had been struck by lightning. Officer Patterson's reaction was the most dramatic of all. The blood drained completely from his face, and his hands began to visibly shake. The confident police officer who had taken the stand hours earlier now looked like a man who had just realized he had walked into a trap of his own making. Order! Judge Hendricks demanded, her gavel striking the bench with authority. I will have order in this courtroom or I will clear the gallery. As the noise subsided, Carter continued with renewed intensity. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, how long did you serve as a Navy SEAL? 15 years of my 25-year career. And what kind of training does that involve? Jasmine's voice took on a different quality now. Still calm but carrying the weight of experience that few people could claim. SEAL training includes extensive instruction in tactical operations, psychological assessment, survival techniques, and specialized skills that most civilians never encounter. Carter nodded, his questions building towards something that Patterson was beginning to understand with growing horror. Does this training include instruction in reading body language, detecting deception, and analyzing human behavior under stress? Yes, it does. Advanced instruction. And specifically, did you receive training in what the military calls SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape? I did. Can you explain to the court what SEER training involves? Jasmine turned slightly toward the jury, her explanation clear and methodical. SEER training prepares military personnel for capture scenarios. Part of that training involves learning to detect deception, resist psychological manipulation, and analyze the truthfulness of statements made under pressure. It's designed to help you survive when people are trying to break you down through lies and intimidation. The implications hit the courtroom like a physical force. Patterson was no longer just facing a defendant. He was facing someone whose entire career had been built around detecting exactly the kind of deception he had attempted. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, on the night of March 15th, when Officer Patterson approached you, were you utilizing any of these skills? From the moment he stepped out of his patrol car, yes. And what did your training tell you about Officer Patterson's behavior? Jasmine turned to look directly at Patterson, her gaze steady and analytical. Every aspect of his approach indicated deception and aggression. His body language, his word choice, his escalation tactics, they were all consistent with someone who had predetermined the outcome of our interaction, regardless of my actual behavior. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sweat now visible on his collar, despite the courtroom's air conditioning. Can you be more specific? His flashlight technique, pointing it directly into my eyes, is a classic intimidation tactic designed to disorient and establish dominance. His verbal patterns showed signs of practiced deception. His physical positioning blocked my natural exit routes. These are all techniques used by people who have done this before. Carter paused, letting the technical analysis sink in. Are you saying that Officer Patterson's behavior suggested this was not an isolated incident? Objection. D.A. Sullivan finally found his voice. Calls for speculation. I'll rephrase, Carter said smoothly. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, based on your extensive training in behavioral analysis, did Officer Patterson's actions appear to follow a practiced pattern? Yes, absolutely. The courtroom was completely silent now, hanging on every word of this devastating analysis. And when he grabbed your arm and falsely arrested you, what did your training tell you to do? To remain calm, document everything I could observe, and wait for the appropriate moment to reveal the truth. Carter walked closer to the witness stand. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, during your 15 years as a Navy SEAL, did you ever encounter situations more dangerous than being confronted by Officer Patterson? A ghost of a smile crossed Jasmine's face. Many times. And in those situations, if you had wanted to harm someone or take their weapon, would you have been capable of doing so? Patterson's attorney started to rise, but Jasmine answered before an objection could be made. If I had wanted to harm Officer Patterson or take his weapon, this trial would never have happened. The statement hung in the air with the weight of absolute truth. Every person in that courtroom understood that they were looking at someone whose capabilities far exceeded anything Patterson had ever encountered. But Jasmine Mitchell was far more than just a veteran. The revelation that Jasmine Mitchell was a Navy SEAL had already sent shockwaves through the courtroom, but Benjamin Carter sensed there was still more to uncover. The jury was completely engaged now, their earlier skepticism replaced by fascination and growing anger at Officer Patterson's deception. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, you mentioned that your SEAL training included specialized skills. Can you elaborate on what those skills encompassed? Jasmine considered her answer carefully, aware that every word was being analyzed by dozens of people. Beyond standard SEAL operations, I received advanced training in psychological operations, interrogation resistance, and intelligence gathering. And does this training include specific instruction in detecting when someone is lying? Extensive instruction. SEER training teaches you to identify deception patterns, body language tells, and vocal stress indicators. It's a matter of survival when you're dealing with hostile interrogators. Carter nodded, his questions building to a crescendo. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, when Officer Patterson was testifying earlier today, were you observing his behavior through the lens of this training? I was. And what did you observe? Jasmine turned to face the jury directly, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone delivering a professional assessment. Officer Patterson displayed classic indicators of deception throughout his testimony. His eye movement patterns, his hand positioning, the slight tremor in his voice when discussing specific details, the way he touched his face when making false statements. Every technique I was trained to identify was present. Several jurors turned to look at Patterson, who had slumped in his chair as if trying to make himself invisible. "Can you give us a specific example?" When he testified that I struck him in the chest, his left hand instinctively moved to touch his face, a classic self-comfort gesture indicating deception. When he claimed I reached for his weapon, his breathing pattern changed and his voice rose in pitch. These are involuntary responses that occur when someone is fabricating details under pressure. D.A. Sullivan looked like he wanted to object, but he had no grounds to challenge the expertise of someone with Jasmine's background. Carter continued his methodical destruction of Patterson's credibility. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, in your professional opinion, was Officer Patterson telling the truth about the events of March 15th? Not about any significant detail, no. And based on your analysis of his behavior patterns, do you believe this was the first time Officer Patterson has given false testimony in court?" "Objection," Sullivan managed to call out. "Speculation." "I'll allow it," Judge Hendricks ruled, her own anger at Patterson's deception becoming apparent. The witness has established her expertise in this area. Jasmine's response was measured but devastating. Based on his comfort level with deception and the practiced nature of his false testimony, I would assess that this is a pattern of behavior, not an isolated incident. The implications rippled through the courtroom like an earthquake. If Patterson had lied in this case, how many other cases had involved fabricated testimony? But Carter wasn't finished. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, I want to ask you about something else. During your military career, did you ever work with other law enforcement agencies?" "Yes, frequently. FBI, ATF, local police departments during joint operations." "And in those interactions, did you encounter officers who conducted themselves professionally?" "Absolutely. The vast majority of law enforcement personnel I worked with were dedicated professionals who took their oath seriously." "So your criticism is not of law enforcement as a whole, but of Officer Patterson's specific conduct?" "Correct. What Officer Patterson did that night was not police work. It was abuse of power motivated by bias." Patterson's attorney leaned over to whisper something to his client, but Patterson just shook his head, staring at the table in front of him. Carter moved in for the final blow. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, if the roles had been reversed, if you had been the one in uniform that night, how would you have handled the same situation?" Jasmine straightened in her chair, her military bearing fully visible now. "I would have approached politely, identified myself clearly, explained my reason for making contact, and treated the person with the dignity and respect that every American citizen deserves. If there was no legal basis for further action, I would have wished them a good evening and left. And if that person had questions about your authority or your reasons for making contact, I would have answered those questions professionally, because in America, citizens have the right to understand why law enforcement is interacting with them." The contrast between Jasmine's professionalism and Patterson's behavior was now crystal clear to everyone in the courtroom. But what happened next would change the entire system forever. As Jasmine completed her testimony and returned to the defense table, the atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as a simple case of he said, she said, had evolved into something much larger, an indictment not just of Officer Patterson's individual conduct, but of the systems that had enabled it. Judge Hendricks called for a brief recess, during which the hallway buzzed with intense conversations. Journalists made frantic phone calls to their editors, spectators debated what they had witnessed, and the police officers who had come to support Patterson quietly slipped away, unwilling to be associated with the unfolding scandal. When court reconvened, D.A. Sullivan looked like a man who had aged years in the span of hours. His carefully constructed case had not just collapsed, it had been systematically demolished by someone whose expertise he couldn't challenge. "Your Honor," Sullivan said wearily, "the state has no further witnesses." Benjamin Carter stood with renewed confidence. "Your Honor, the defense has one additional piece of evidence to present." Judge Hendricks nodded grimly. "Proceed." Carter retrieved another manila envelope from his briefcase. Your Honor, the defense presents Exhibit B, Officer Patterson's personnel file, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. Patterson's face went ashen. His attorney started to object, but Judge Hendricks cut him off with a sharp look. I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Carter. Carter opened the file, revealing a stack of documents that represented years of complaints, incidents, and warning signs that had been systematically ignored. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you're about to hear represents not just one officer's misconduct, but a pattern of behavior that extends over several years. As Carter began reading from the file, a picture emerged that was even more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. March 2019, complaint filed by Marcus Washington, Army veteran, alleging Officer Patterson used excessive force during a traffic stop. Complaint dismissed without investigation. The connection to military personnel sent a chill through the courtroom. August 2019, complaint filed by Maria Santos, alleging Officer Patterson made racially inappropriate comments during arrest. Complaint filed but no disciplinary action taken. February 2020, complaint filed by James Riley, Marine Corps veteran, alleging Officer Patterson falsified details in arrest report. Complaint dismissed. As Carter continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each entry. The pattern was undeniable. Officer Patterson had been targeting minorities and veterans for years, with his misconduct consistently covered up or ignored by his supervisors. November 2021, complaint filed by David Chen, alleging Officer Patterson planted evidence during search. Under investigation, no resolution recorded. January 2022, complaint filed by Sarah Williams, Navy veteran, alleging Officer Patterson used false testimony in court proceedings. Complaint filed but case sealed. By now, several jurors were visibly angry, their faces reflecting the growing realization that they were witnessing not just individual corruption, but systemic failure. Carter closed the file and turned to address the courtroom directly. Your Honor, what we see here is not just Officer Patterson's pattern of misconduct, but the pattern of a department that consistently failed to hold him accountable. Every complaint, every warning sign, every victim who came forward was ignored or dismissed. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, her expression grave. Mr. Carter, are you suggesting that Officer Patterson's superiors were aware of these complaints? I am, Your Honor, and I'm suggesting that their failure to act enabled the incident involving Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. From his seat at the plaintiff's table, Patterson finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Your Honor, I want to change my testimony. The courtroom fell silent. Even Judge Hendricks looked surprised by the unexpected development. Officer Patterson, you've already been sworn in and given your testimony. Are you saying you wish to recant previous statements? Patterson's hands were shaking as he stood. Yes, Your Honor, The video evidence, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's testimony, it's all true. The admission sent shockwaves through the room. Patterson's own attorney looked stunned by his client's sudden confession. I lied about what happened that night, Patterson continued, his voice growing stronger as if a weight was being lifted from his shoulders. I falsified the charges against Ms. Mitchell. She never struck me, never reached for my weapon, never resisted arrest. But the consequences were just beginning. Officer Patterson's admission of perjury sent the courtroom into chaos. Spectators gasped, journalists furiously scribbled notes, and Judge Hendricks struck her gavel repeatedly to restore order. Even D.A. Sullivan sat in stunned silence, watching his case not just collapse, but explode into a scandal that would have far-reaching consequences. Order! Judge Hendricks demanded, her voice cutting through the tumult. I will have order in this courtroom. As silence gradually returned, Patterson remained standing, his face pale but somehow relieved. The weight of maintaining his lies for months had clearly taken its toll, and his confession seemed to have lifted a burden he could no longer carry. Officer Patterson, Judge Hendricks said sternly, do you understand the implications of what you've just admitted? Yes, Your Honor. I understand that I committed perjury, that I filed false charges, and that I violated my oath as a police officer. The judge studied him for a long moment. And why are you admitting this now? Patterson glanced toward Jasmine, who watched him with the same analytical calm she had displayed throughout the trial. Because she's right, about all of it, and because continuing to lie would only make things worse. Judge Hendricks turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, in light of Officer Patterson's admission, I believe we can move directly to your deliberation. However, given the extraordinary circumstances of this case, I want to address several matters first. She turned back to Patterson. Officer Patterson, I am holding you in contempt of court for perjury. You will remain in custody pending formal charges. Bailiff, please take Officer Patterson into custody. As handcuffs clicked around Patterson's wrists, the reality of the situation hit everyone present. A police officer was being arrested in his own case, having admitted to lying under oath about charges he had fabricated. But Judge Hendricks wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate investigation into the Chicago Police Department's handling of complaints against Officer Patterson. The pattern of ignored misconduct presented in this courtroom suggests systemic failures that must be addressed. She turned to D.A. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, I trust the state will be dropping all charges against Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. Sullivan stood shakily. Yes, Your Honor. All charges are hereby dismissed. The gallery erupted in applause, but Judge Hendricks quickly restored order. We're not finished here, she announced. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, please approach the bench. Jasmine stood and walked forward, her military bearing evident in every step. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, this court owes you an apology. You have been subjected to false charges, character assassination, and a legal system that initially failed to recognize the truth of your situation. Your service to this country and your dignity throughout this ordeal reflect the highest standards of American citizenship. Judge Hendricks paused, her voice carrying the weight of formal declaration. Furthermore, I'm recommending that you file civil charges against Officer Patterson and potentially against the Chicago Police Department for the systematic pattern of misconduct that enabled this incident. Jasmine nodded respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. I will consider all appropriate legal remedies. As the formal proceedings concluded, the courtroom began to empty, but the story was far from over. In the hallway, Jasmine was approached by reporters eager for statements, but she handled each question with the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the trial. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, called out a reporter from the Chicago Tribune, what do you want people to take away from this case? Jasmine paused, considering her words carefully. This case isn't just about me or Officer Patterson. It's about accountability. When those who swear to protect and serve abuse their power, the entire system suffers. But when the truth comes to light and justice is served, it reminds us that our institutions can work when we demand they work properly. Will you be pursuing civil action? Justice takes many forms, Jasmine replied. Legal remedies are just one part of ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to others. Benjamin Carter joined her in the hallway, his face beaming with the satisfaction of a job well done. Jasmine, I have to ask, when did you know we were going to win this case? Jasmine smiled, the first genuinely warm expression anyone had seen from her throughout the entire ordeal. From the moment Officer Patterson took the stand and started lying. My training taught me that the truth always emerges, especially when someone is skilled enough to recognize it and patient enough to let it reveal itself. If this story moved you, please type respect below to show support for all veterans who have faced similar injustices in our legal system. But what happened next would surprise everyone who thought this case was over. 3 months after the trial that captivated the nation, the ripple effects of Jasmine Mitchell's victory continued to spread through the Chicago Police Department and beyond. What had begun as one woman's fight for justice had evolved into a catalyst for systemic change that reached far beyond the courtroom. Officer Michael Patterson had been formally charged with perjury, filing false reports and civil rights violations. His trial was scheduled for the following year, but the evidence against him was so overwhelming that his attorney was already negotiating a plea agreement. Patterson's police career was over, his pension forfeit, and his reputation permanently destroyed. But the investigation that Judge Hendricks had ordered revealed problems that went far deeper than one corrupt officer. Chief of Police Robert Martinez stood before a packed press conference room, his face grim as he addressed the media and the public. The independent investigation into our department's handling of complaints against Officer Patterson has revealed serious deficiencies in our oversight and accountability systems. The investigation had uncovered not just the ignored complaints against Patterson, but a broader pattern of misconduct being swept under the rug. Supervisors who had dismissed legitimate complaints were facing disciplinary action, and several cases were being reopened for review. Effective immediately, Chief Martinez continued, the Chicago Police Department is implementing comprehensive reforms to our complaint process, our body camera protocols, and our officer accountability systems. The changes were extensive and unprecedented. All body cameras would now upload footage automatically to secure cloud servers, preventing the kind of malfunctions that had allowed Patterson to operate without oversight. Complaints against officers would be investigated by an independent civilian review board, removing the conflicts of interest that had protected Patterson for years. Most significantly, the department announced a new training program focusing on de-escalation, bias recognition, and community relations, with input from military veterans who understood both the importance of discipline and the reality of serving diverse communities. Meanwhile, Jasmine Mitchell had become an unlikely symbol of justice and accountability. She received invitations to speak at law enforcement conferences, veterans organizations, and community groups across the country. Her story had resonated with people who had experienced similar injustices, but lacked her unique combination of training and determination. At a packed auditorium at Northwestern University Law School, Jasmine addressed a crowd of future lawyers, police officers, and community leaders. "My case wasn't unique because of who I am," she told the attentive audience. "It was unique because I had the training to recognize what was happening and the resources to fight back effectively. But for every case like mine that reaches the public eye, there are dozens of others involving people who don't have those advantages." The audience listened intently as she continued. "The real question isn't whether Officer Patterson was held accountable. It's whether we're committed to creating systems that prevent these situations from occurring in the first place." Her words carried the weight of experience and the authority of someone who had served both in combat overseas and in the battle for justice at home. The impact extended beyond Chicago as well. Other cities began reviewing their complaint processes, and several police departments reached out to Jasmine for consultation on reform efforts. Her military background gave her credibility with law enforcement personnel who might have dismissed criticism from civilian activists. In Washington, D.C., members of Congress cited her case during hearings on police reform legislation. Representative Angela Williams, herself a veteran, referenced Jasmine's experience during testimony about the need for federal oversight of local police departments. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's case demonstrates both the best and worst of our institutions," Representative Williams said during the hearing. "It shows us that when our systems work properly, justice can prevail. But it also reveals how badly our systems can fail when accountability is absent." Back in Chicago, the Civilian Review Board was processing its first cases under the new protocols. The board included veterans, community leaders, and retired law enforcement officers committed to fair but thorough investigation of misconduct complaints. Dr. Sarah Chen, a retired Army colonel and the board's first chairwoman, explained their approach. "We're not anti-police. We're pro-accountability. Our job is to ensure that the vast majority of officers who serve with honor and integrity aren't undermined by the few who abuse their power." The body camera program had already prevented several incidents that might have escalated into the kind of confrontation that Jasmine had faced. Officers, knowing that their actions were being automatically recorded and reviewed, had led to more professional interactions across the board. These stories of courage and justice inspire people all around the world. Let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these powerful messages of accountability are reaching. The final impact would transform law enforcement in ways that would last for generations. 1 year after her trial, Lieutenant Commander Jasmine Mitchell stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, surrounded by other recipients of the Presidential Citizens Medal. The award, given to Americans who have performed exemplary service for their country, recognized not just her military service, but her role in advancing justice and accountability in civilian life. President Harrison's citation read, "For her unwavering commitment to truth, her dignified response to injustice, and her dedication to improving the systems that serve all Americans, Lieutenant Commander Jasmine Mitchell exemplifies the finest traditions of military service and civilian leadership." The ceremony was attended by law enforcement leaders, veterans advocates, and civil rights organizations. A coalition that might have seemed unlikely before Jasmine's case brought together groups that shared common ground in their commitment to justice. Chief Martinez, whose department had undergone dramatic reforms, was among those in attendance. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell didn't just seek justice for herself, he said during the ceremony. She forced all of us to confront hard truths about our institutions and our responsibilities to the communities we serve. The reforms implemented in Chicago had become a model for departments across the nation. The Independent Review Board had processed over 200 complaints in its first year, with a resolution rate that had restored community confidence in the accountability process. Use of force incidents had declined by 40%, partly due to improved training and partly due to officers understanding that their actions would be subject to genuine oversight. Officer Patterson, meanwhile, had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for civil rights violations and perjury. During his sentencing hearing, he had offered a public apology that many viewed as genuine, a man who had finally understood the harm his actions had caused. "So I let my biases and my anger control my actions," Patterson said during his sentencing. "I violated my oath, I violated the law, and I violated the trust of the community I was supposed to serve." Lieutenant Commander Mitchell deserved better, and so did every person I interacted with as a police officer. The judge in Patterson's case had been stern but fair, noting that while Patterson's eventual honesty was commendable, it couldn't undo the years of misconduct that had preceded it. But perhaps the most significant impact of Jasmine's case was its influence on a new generation of law enforcement officers and legal professionals. Police academies across the country now included her case as a study in the importance of integrity and accountability. Law schools used the trial transcript to teach students about the intersection of military service, civil rights, and effective advocacy. At the FBI Academy in Quantico, Jasmine had become a regular speaker, addressing new agents about the importance of treating every citizen with dignity, regardless of their background or circumstances. "Your badge and your uniform give you authority," she told one class of recruits. "But with that authority comes the responsibility to use it wisely and fairly. The moment you let bias or personal feelings override your professional judgment is the moment you stop being a guardian and become a problem." Her words carried particular weight because of her own background in military service and her understanding of the psychological challenges faced by those in positions of authority. The civil suit that Jasmine had filed against Patterson and the Chicago Police Department had been settled for an undisclosed amount, but she had donated the majority of the settlement to organizations supporting veterans' rights and police reform. The gesture reinforced her message that the case had never been about personal gain, but about systemic change. 2 years after her trial, Jasmine accepted a position as Director of Accountability and Training for a consortium of police departments in Illinois. Her job was to help implement the kind of reforms that her case had inspired, working directly with law enforcement leaders to create cultures of integrity and professionalism. "Change is never easy," she said during her first press conference in the new role. "But it's necessary. The officers who serve with honor deserve to work in departments that support and recognize their professionalism. The communities they serve deserve to trust that their interactions with law enforcement will be fair and respectful." Her unique combination of military experience and civilian credibility made her an effective bridge between law enforcement and the communities they served. Officers respected her background and understood that her criticisms came from a place of wanting to improve the profession, not tear it down. As she stood in her new office, looking out at the city of Chicago where her fight for justice had begun, Jasmine reflected on the unexpected path that had led her here. She had retired from military service, expecting a quiet civilian life, never imagining that she would become a national symbol of accountability and reform. But perhaps that was the point. Justice often comes from unexpected places, carried by ordinary people, who refuse to accept that things have to remain the way they've always been. The final lesson of Jasmine Mitchell's story wasn't just about one woman's victory over injustice. It was about the power of truth to create lasting change when it's spoken by someone with the courage to stand up and the skill to make their voice heard. Her case had reminded America that accountability isn't just an abstract ideal. It's a practical necessity for maintaining the trust between those who serve and those they're sworn to protect. And in courtrooms, police stations, and training academies across the nation, her story continued to inspire a new generation of professionals committed to the principle that justice isn't just an outcome, it's a way of life. Thank you to everyone who typed respect, and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support for justice and accountability means everything. If these stories of courage inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of truth prevailing over corruption. Until next time, keep believing in the power of standing up for what's right.